In this lesson, we'll begin our discussion of the respiratory system. We'll start off by focusing at the histology throughout the respiratory system, and then we'll take a look at the upper respiratory tract. We'll take a look at the nose and the nasal cavity, the pharynx, which is the throat, and then the voice box or the larynx. So the lining of the respiratory system is known as a respiratory mucosa. We need to have a mucous membrane lining any system open to the outside world. So a mucous membrane typically has two components, a layer of epithelial cells and then connective tissue underneath it, and it's usually areolar connective tissue. We call this areolar connective tissue that's under the epithelium, the lamina propria. Either name would be okay, areolar connective tissue or the lamina propria. Now, depending on where we are throughout the respiratory tract, the lamina propria will be a little bit different. In the upper respiratory system, such as like the trachea, the bronchi, the lamina propria is going to have embedded in it many mucus glands that secrete mucus onto the epithelial surface. That will help to maybe catch debris, also to keep the respiratory tract moist. As we get a little bit lower, think about this. As the tubes become smaller and smaller, we don't want to produce a lot of mucus. Those tubes would get filled with mucus and we would suffocate, we wouldn't be able to survive. So we would see less and less glands, but we start to see more smooth muscle. That smooth muscle helps to regulate the diameter of the breathing tubes, right, the bronchioles and that type of thing. All right, so it's important to know that the respiratory mucosa or this mucous membrane is going to have epithelial cells and a layer of areolar connective tissue underneath it. We call that the lamina propria. Now, not all of the epithelial cells are the same along the entire respiratory system. They're going to vary based on the location and the function of the organ. One of the most prevalent epithelial cells that we see is going to be pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. These in the nasal cavity and the upper part of the pharynx or the throat are going to have also many mucus cells, right? So in the nasal cavity, in the superior portion of the pharynx, right, if we were to look under the microscope at that tissue, right, we would see the epithelium of this respiratory mucosa being a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And think about it, why would these cells have cilia in the nose and maybe the upper portion of the throat? Is to catch any debris, right? Do for filtering. So here's a picture of the pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and then these are like the goblet cells. These contain mucus. These little hair-like projections up top here, those are the cilia. And so all of this nasal cavity, the upper part of the pharynx, we're going to learn that's called the nasal pharynx, is going to have this. Before I go back to the notes, now as the respiratory tract goes down here into the oral part of the throat, right, this is the tongue, the epithelium is going to change. It's going to go from being pseudostratified columnar to being stratified squamous epithelium. And if you remember, stratified squamous epithelium is many layers of cells that ultimately are flat up on top. And that's going to be here. Now think about, why would that be? Well, we not only share the oral pharynx with the respiratory system, we share it with the digestive system. So now as we eat food and liquids and things like that, these cells here are going to slough off, right? We don't want to just have one layer of cells. We want to have multiple layers of cells. So on the inferior portions of the pharynx, the epithelium changes to stratified squamous. Once we get past the throat, we then go back to being pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. Things like the trachea we're going to learn, the bronchi, right? All of these tubes in here that we're going to learn, they are going to be predominantly the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, as we get closer to the air sacs, then the tubes become smaller and smaller. They start to become cuboidal. And then finally, by the time we get to the air sacs, the air sacs are actually made up of simple squamous epithelium. And if you think about that, right, this simple squamous epithelium is going to allow for nice, easy gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air sac and the bloodstream. So it's important to know that we have epithelium lining the entire respiratory tract, but it's not the same throughout the tract. It's going to vary based on the function of the organ. So let's take a look at the kind of how air flows through the respiratory system. We'll start at the nose, and then through the next couple lessons, we'll work our way right down to the air sac. So what is the nose? The nose itself is formed by a bunch of different structures. The frontal bone above, the nasal bones also kind of above, the maxilla to the side, and then we also have some cartilage. So this is a obviously a picture of the skull. Now we see here this would be the nasal cavity, but the nose itself, like the bridge of the nose here, is going to be your nasal bones. This part right here, frontal bone. Okay, the maxilla right here on the side, they're forming the side wall, that type of thing. We'll look at the inside structures in a minute. There's the openings into the nasal cavity from the outside. They're referred to the external nares. This is what we would commonly call the nostrils, right? So air enters the respiratory system through these external nares, and then the area behind the external nares is known as the vestibule. And the vestibule also has some hair there for filtering, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. All right, so this is just a picture of the nose. Again, you can see here's where the nasal bones would be. Here's our frontal bone right over here. The maxilla would be this general area. But what keeps the nose shape is actually plates of cartilage, right? And here they put down the cartilaginous portions. And then here we could see the external nares, right? That would be the nostrils. Bear with me one second. Just want to show you real quick. So this would be the nostrils from my outside view. This area here would be the vestibule, right? So that would be the area behind the nostrils, and that's where the air kind of accumulates once it goes into the once it comes into the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity has some boundaries also. The upper portion of the nasal cavity is formed by the cribriform plate. That's part of the ethmoid bone, if you remember. And this is also the region where we have all the dendrites of cranial nerve number 1 hanging out up there. So as different chemicals and molecules come up, they go to the top of the nasal cavity. They stimulate cranial nerve number 1, right? That sends a signal back to your brain, and you perceive what you smell. Okay, so we come up over here, this is all going to be the cribriform plate. This is the roof of the nasal cavity. Again, that's part of the ethmoid bone. The floor of the pelvic nasal cavity, excuse me, the floor of the nasal cavity is going to be formed by the hard palate right here. And then once the bone ends, there's actually going to be soft tissue here. This is the soft palate. And then the end of the soft palate is that little punching bag. If you looked into the back of your throat, that's going to be called the uvula. Okay, so the hard palate forms the floor of the nasal cavity. Like I said, that also is going to separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. So it's basically this line here is the floor of the nasal cavity, but it's the ceiling or the roof of the oral cavity, right? The ceiling or the roof of the oral cavity. As I mentioned before, the soft palate that extends behind the hard palate, and that little punching bag, like I mentioned before, that hangs down when you look inside your mouth, that's the end of the soft palate. We call that the uvula. You'll learn that as you swallow, we do this as part of the digestive system, this whole soft palate and uvula raise up and they block this opening here so food doesn't go backwards into your nasal cavity, right? We want the food to go down into the this tube down here, which is the esophagus. Okay, so cribriform plate, or the ceiling of the nasal cavity, the hard palate, soft palate, and the uvula. Now, our nasal cavity is not just one chamber. It's actually divided into two separate cavities, the right and the left, and that's formed by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, right? So this green blade coming down right here, this is the perpendicular plate, and then that's going to join with the vomer bone. This is called the vomer. In the front, it's not one complete wall. They would right here in front of these two bones, there would be some hyaline cartilage also. Right, so if somebody goes for surgery of a deviated septum, right, they may be working on the perpendicular plate and or the vomer or even hyaline cartilage, depending on how bad the deviation is. Right, so this is what we call the nasal septum. Very simply, septum means a wall. Now, our nasal cavity has these sinuses associated with it. The function of the sinuses is the sinuses humidify air for us. Not so much on a humid day. We don't really worry about that too much. But think about a day in January or February where it's 5 degrees. Of dry air. If we were to just breathe in through our mouth, that dry air would go directly down into our respiratory passages. The mucous membranes would dry out, and you know how things, when they dry, they crack. Like if your skin dries out, it cracks. Well, now we would have cracking in the mucous membrane, and we would get infections and potentially die. So the preferred way to breathe is through the nose. This way the sinuses can moisturize the air. So we have four main ones. There's one in the frontal bone, there's one in the body of the sphenoid, there's some in the lateral masses of the ethmoid bone, and then also in the maxilla. I just saw one here a second ago, just to kind of give you an idea. On this picture here, this is where the frontal bone goes up. This little cavity right here is the frontal sinus. So there's an opening and moisture can come down into here. Right, the ethmoid sinus would be, I'm sorry, the sphenoid sinus would be back over here. The maxillary sinuses are like here and here. Now, as the air flows through the nasal cavity, the air is going to pass through these narrow passageways that we call meatuses. All right, so let's kind of do the airflow. So the air goes into the external nares, it then goes into the vestibule, which would be right here. Now, if you remember from Anatomy 1, there are three nasal concha. 1, 2, 3. The superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha. And as the air flows in, the air is going to go through these tubes, and it's like narrow passageway between the nasal concha, and those are the meatuses. So this would be the superior meatus, the middle meatus, and the last little tube down here is the inferior meatus. And as that air goes through those passageways, they become warmed and filtered and even moisturized. Okay, so you should know the three nasal concha, 1, 2, 3, and then their associated meatuses, 1, 2, 3, right? Where 1 is always superior, 2 is middle, and 3 is inferior. Now, as the air flows backwards, the air is going to move into something known as the internal nares area, also known as the conae. I didn't put it here, but we call this area the internal nares, and that's going to be this region over here. Okay, and I have another picture up for that there. Right about over here. So this would be the internal nares. Right, so far the airflow goes like this: external nares, vestibule, through the meatuses, into the internal nares right over here. Okay, so that's it for the nasal cavity and the nose. As the air continues to flow now from the internal nares, it's going to pass into the throat, but we're not going to call it the throat. We're going to call it the pharynx. And you can think of this as an area or a chamber that's shared not only by the respiratory system, but by the digestive system. And the pharynx basically begins at the internal nares and it goes all the way down to the entrance of the voice box for the respiratory system or the entrance of the digestive system at the esophagus. So we divide the internal nares into three parts, but just to show you real quick. So this dotted line right here represents the internal nares, and it's going to go, the pharynx now is going to go back from here all the way down. So this would be the part going to the digestive system. This is where the esophagus begins, okay, or where the right in here where the airflow is going to be, where the respiratory system begins. So we divide the pharynx, I think I may have said internal nares before, we divide the pharynx into three parts. From the internal nares to the uvula here, this area is known as the nasopharynx. From the uvula to the top of this structure here, this is the epiglottis. This is going to be called the oropharynx, right? And this is the tongue, so it's kind of the area behind the tongue. And then from the epiglottis down to where the esophagus begins, right? And then the airflow goes into the larynx. This is known as the laryngopharynx, right? So nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So there's a couple of structures that are in the nasopharynx that I'd like you to be able to find on the models. The one thing that we see in the nasopharynx is going to be the pharyngeal tonsils. This is what we sometimes call or refer to as the adenoids. So way up here, I didn't label it on this picture. This right here, this structure is actually lymph tissue. This is going to be the pharyngeal tonsil. Then this little thing right here is an opening to the tube that goes to your middle ear. You can call that the auditory tube, or you may have learned it as the eustachian tube. All right, so here's the opening to the auditory tube. Here is the pharyngeal tonsil, or what we would commonly call the adenoid. The the oropharynx is the middle portion of the pharynx. That's going to contain tonsils also. On your side walls of the oropharynx, they kind of look like walnuts to me when you look in somebody's mouth. This is going to be called the palatine tonsil. These are the ones that are most commonly removed during surgery. The adenoids, the pharyngeal tonsils, are removed on everybody. But when people do have their tonsils taken out, usually it's the palatine ones. That's the main one. Then there's another set of tonsils here called the lingual tonsils. Okay, these tonsils are usually covered in a separate lesson in the immune system, the immunity, or the lymphatic system. So here's our oropharynx. And then finally, like I said, from the epiglottis down to where the esophagus begins, right, and the voice box begins, this is going to be the laryngopharynx. There are no main structures in here that you have to be able to find. So the last part of the upper respiratory system is the larynx, right? So now the airflow goes through the pharynx and it's going to enter the larynx. This is a cartilaginous structure that surrounds something known as the glottis. The glottis is the narrow slit-like opening that allows the air to go further down into the lower respiratory tract. And the larynx extends from the third cervical vertebrae to the sixth cervical vertebrae. As far as its structure, there's actually six cartilage cartilages that are associated with the larynx. The first three are some of the larger ones. They're unpaired and they form the majority of the larynx. The first one I want to show you is the thyroid cartilage. I also want you to know what it's made up of. This is made up of hyaline cartilage, which is strong because we cannot have the larynx collapse. If our larynx collapsed, right, we would suffocate. We wouldn't be able to breathe. So it helps to maintain the shape of the larynx. So here's an anterior view of the larynx. All of this front part here, and then I'm going to go to a back view, and side wall here and here is going to be the thyroid cartilage. Notice the larynx is not closed in the back at this level. So that means the thyroid cartilage forms the anterior wall and the two lateral walls. It does not close in the back. Also, right about here, on males more than females, the thyroid cartilage may become more prominent. This is what we call the laryngeal prominence. This is commonly called the Adam's apple. One of the reasons it's bigger in a male is during puberty, as we grow, during puberty, the testosterone in a male causes the laryngeal prominence to be bigger in a male. So that's the reason for that. So it's important to know that the thyroid cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage, and that the thyroid cartilage forms the front and the side walls of the larynx, right? It does not go around and close up the back. Now, the next cartilage is called the cricoid cartilage. So that's this cartilage here, right underneath the thyroid cartilage. The cricoid cartilage, you also should know, is made up of hyaline cartilage, and it forms the front part of the larynx here. But watch this, as we go to the back, it gets taller and it closes up the back. So this part of the larynx where the cricoid cartilage is closed in the back. Okay, so it's made up of hyaline cartilage, and it forms also the posterior portion of the larynx. So we just want to make like a note just to be clear on that, right? It kind of encircles the whole larynx. I don't want you to think it's just in the posterior portion, but it does close up the posterior portion. Now we're going to see some of the smaller cartilages inside the larynx that help to produce sound are going to attach to the cricoid cartilage, and one of them is known as the arytenoid cartilage. I'll show you that in a moment. The third major cartilage, I'll show you from the back, is this one here. This is known as the epiglottis, but unlike the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, this is made up of elastic cartilage. The reason for that is this: when we swallow, this comes down and covers the opening where the air would flow. It would be like right in this area here, so that food and liquids don't get down into our respiratory system. But when we're done swallowing, we can't just have that laying on top of the glottis, that opening, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to breathe. We wouldn't get air in. So the epiglottis has to pop back up. The reason it does that, it's made up of elastic cartilage. All right, so that's a little bit different. All right, so this is composed of elastic cartilage, and it's attached to the thyroid cartilage by some ligaments, right? A little bit beyond the scope of this course as far as the names of those. All right, so that's going to be our epiglottis over here, and I think we just saw it here a little bit. All right, so those are the three main cartilages forming the main body of the larynx. Thyroid cartilage, number one. Cricoid cartilage, number two. And then we see the epiglottis over here. Epiglottis, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. And here's just a side view, same type of thing. We kind of see the front and side wall of the thyroid cartilage. Here's the epiglottis, and here's part of the cricoid cartilage. Not a side view really. This is a sagittal section, right, where we actually sliced through the larynx. Now, there are three pair of smaller cartilages. These are also made up of hyaline cartilage, but if you just want to jot down their function is to produce sound, right? And in the lecture portion of this course, you go through how sound is produced. These are the arytenoid, the corniculate, and the cuneiform cartilages. Let's take a look. So this triangular cartilage right here and on this side, these are the arytenoid cartilages. Then on this view here, we can see the arytenoid cartilage is kind of triangular to me. That's how I kind of see it. Then there's a little one here. It kind of reminds me of a bird's beak right there. That little beak looking structure, that is the corniculate. The cuneiform we don't see. That would be somewhere along this ligament here. When we actually were to make the vocal cords, it would be in that vocal fold. So you're not going to see that on this picture. Just know that by name. So arytenoid, the one that looks like a beak, like to a bird, is the corniculate. So that corniculate would be this one right on top over here. It's a little bit hard to see on this picture. All right, so arytenoid, corniculate. You're not going to see on these diagrams here the cuneiform, but all three functions are going to be the same. Again, if you just want to jot down, they are involved with sound production. Okay, so before I go to the next set of notes, notice, guys, that there are ligaments that attach the arytenoid and the corniculate cartilages to the thyroid cartilage here in the front. These here are going to be the foundation for our vocal cords. Okay, this ligament up top here, just while we're on this picture, is called the vestibular ligament. And then this is going to be called the vocal ligament. This is going to actually form what we call our false vocal cords. They're not involved with making sound. They're more like protective in nature. And then the vocal ligaments are going to form the true vocal cords, which are involved in making sound. So as these cartilages here, they swivel, they move. As they move, they tighten and laxen or loosen these ligaments, and that's what changes the pitch, right? As we change the pitch, right? So that's what we'll take a look at next. These are the I call them laryngeal ligaments. There's two of them. Okay, so that's our next set of notes here. Here's the laryngeal ligaments. Basically, they are extending between the thyroid cartilage anteriorly and that arytenoid cartilage in the back. So give this one a little highlight. That first one, that top one, is known as the vestibular ligament. I'll show you again. Right there. That's your vestibular ligament. These are actually covered by folds of epithelium, right? We call them laryngeal epithelium, and these folds are known as vestibular folds, and this is what we commonly call the false vocal cords. They are not involved in sound production, but their function is more to prevent any foreign object from entering the glottis. The glottis, we're going to see, is the opening between the vocal folds. So we don't want any, any foreign objects to go down. So this is more protective in nature, all right, and they protect these the true vocal folds below. All right, so the vestibular ligament here has these epithelium folds over them. This would be where the false vocal fold is going to be. Then this is the next ligament. This is the vocal ligament. If you want to highlight this one here, these are going to form our true vocal cords, and if you want to jot down, these are going to produce the sound. Now, the opening between the vocal folds is known as the glottis. Okay, so again, here's your two ligaments. What I did here is I just kind of blew up this sagittal section of what it would look like on a model. So the vocal fold here on top is going to be a little thicker when you see it on the model. This is called the false vocal cord, or if you want to call it the vestibular fold, either or. Then below here, this would be the true vocal cord right here. And then the opening in between is the glottis. Right, and then last picture here, this is kind of a superior view. This here is the base of the tongue. Here's the epiglottis. If you were to look down with a laryngoscope, this is what it would look like. This is the epiglottis. Then here you would see these big folds out here. These are the vestibular folds, right? The false vocal cords. Then these lines here would be the vocal folds or the true vocal cords, and then the space in between is here. So here is what it looks like when the vocal cords are open, and then here's when they're closed. So they kind of open and close. All right, so that completes this lesson on the respiratory mucosa and the structure of the organs of the upper respiratory tract, the nasal cavity and the nose, the pharynx, the larynx.